Well, thank you so much, everyone. It's absolutely wonderful to be here in Prince Edward Island with you today and this afternoon. My first time here, and I know at least one other person's first time up on this panel. So people sometimes find it surprising that I am both a doctor and a writer. And I'm very fortunate. I'm close to the point in my life now that half of my work is clinical and administrative, and the other half is essentially creative pursuits, quite unusual. But I want to tell you that being a doctor and being a writer actually have quite a bit of things in common. And actually that's also true of being a panel moderator as well, I would say. They all involve working with stories. They all involve finding common themes, building tolerance for uncertainty, and bringing threads together and weaving them into something that wasn't there before. And so just before I introduce my wonderful colleagues up here today, I want to share with you 3 things that you did not hear in my biography, because they inform the stories that I tell about medicine, but they also inform the shape and the questions that I'm going to be asking my friends and colleagues this afternoon, and that will underwrite a lot of our discussion. So the first thing I want to share with you is that I grew up with 2 profoundly disabled siblings. And my earliest experiences with medicine were experiences that left me questioning why. Why was medicine so often impersonal, seemingly inhuman, and why did there seem to be a dearth of compassion when it came to what it felt like to be a patient dealing with care in the medical system? So I was a person who had a lot of anger at doctors. The second thing I want to tell you, you heard that I'm a writer and musician, but I was a writer and a musician before I became a doctor. And those parts of me absolutely inform how I see medicine and how I see our discussion unfolding today. And the third thing that I want to say to you is, after 30 years immersed in this world, I now understand that so much of our experience seeking medical care is lacking because our system is utterly dysfunctional. And one of the problems with that dysfunction is it compounds experiences with systemic racism, ableism, and inequities in healthcare. But to further complicate the picture, healthcare workers are actually often harmed practicing in this system because it's so broken. So I share that with you because I think any serious conversation about the healthcare system has to look both at patients and the experience of practitioners, because just as you discussed in the climate change panel earlier today, it's an ecosystem. Everything is absolutely interdependent. So I share those thoughts and comments to set the tone for the types of questions that we're going to explore together today and try to investigate with you together. We have been tasked with exploring 2 complex and diverse subjects, issues that are separate in their own right, but that do indeed have some connectivity between them. And those issues are wide disparities in the healthcare system, but also how arts-based approaches can lead to more compassionate care. So we are going to spend about the next 40 minutes being a bit like Dr. Cashin, who in a moment I'm going to tell you is a radiologist, taking a wide variety of stories and experiences and holding them up to the light to get a better look. And so speaking of Dr. Cashin, I'm going to introduce her first. I'm going to go in alphabetical order. Dr. Paula Cashin is a Mi'kmaq radiologist from Newfoundland. She is a faculty lead for Indigenous Health at Memorial University. She also has a master's in law from Osgoode Hall, and she holds many senior leadership roles in numerous Canadian healthcare organizations where she's been absolutely instrumental as a champion of Indigenous health equity. And she also leans heavily on storytelling in her work. My second colleague over at the end, Dr. Megan Miller. So Dr. Miller is from Prince Edward Island, and she is a physician involved with the Medical Assistance in Dying, or MAID program, and she's been part of that since it became a legal option in Canada in 2016. She has held multiple clinical and leadership roles in the province, and she also supports physicians who are struggling with stress related to the practice of medicine. And Dr. Miller's work, especially at the end of life, is deeply informed by a holistic approach that includes incorporating the arts and humanities. And finally, on my right, Dr. Eberhard Renner. Dr. Renner is originally from Switzerland. and he is the former head of the liver transplant program at Toronto General Hospital. He is a retired professor of internal medicine at the University of Manitoba, where he may or may not have been my boss. And he's also a lifelong lover of the visual arts. So in 2011, Dr. Renner resumed a regular painting practice that has expanded not only in recent years, but since his retirement. And his works can be found in private collections in Canada, the United States, and Europe. So with that, let's begin our journey. Abby, I'm going to start with you this afternoon. So you have just retired, and you are looking back at your career in a rearview mirror. My question for you to begin us off this afternoon is, how did your life as an artist influence your medical practice?
I probably should start a little bit further back. So I was drawn to drawing and painting as a young boy, and then did some courses in art during high school and early university, and then with building a career, having a family, art took actually second place. And when I was in Toronto, liver transplant is a high stake, high speed, stress situation. My wife must have felt that, and in 2011, for my birthday, she gave me brushes, acrylic paint, and a canvas. And since then, I started painting again. And the reason I painted initially, and probably still now, is really to try and find a balance. A balance for myself, because I think that is really important, to be able to be open to patients, to be open to listen, and to talk to them in the right way. There's an old saying, I don't know who said that first, but medicine is a science and an art. And I think the science part is a prerequisite to be a good physician, but it's not sufficient. And so if you are just a scientist, you don't have this ability of being empathic, to listen, to find the right approach to the individual patients that it's in front of you. And I think art, for me as a provider, helps me to find this balance, to have this openness in a hectic environment. So that's kind of, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's I think a great place for us to begin. What a perfect jumping off point.
So that's one of my recent slides. It's just a sketch done actually on an iPad. And it's a memory of a sunset at the lake where I was living in Switzerland.
Abby, I think that leads really nicely into a story that Megan shared about her early medical training. And Megan, when you were first training and we were talking and having some conversations, getting to know each other and prepare for the panel, you shared a story about how a piece of artwork came to inform some of your earliest thoughts about the relationship between art and the patient experience. And I wonder if you could tell us about those paintings.
Abby, can I ask you to advance the slide, please? Sure. Thank you. So delightful to see Ebby's paintings, and I've gone through a number of his paintings on the website, and it's just so impressive to see the work that he does and the power of those images. And this is an image that became very powerful for me, amongst others. Many of you will know the name Robert Pope. Robert was a young man, a Nova Scotia resident, and a person who was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. And he was a painter at that time, had gone to NASCAD. And he spent the 10 years of his medical journey before he unfortunately died of his illness, painting his experience in that illness and what that was like for him. And so some of you may recognize and have seen the book Illness and Healing. And this is one of many really profound images that he created during his time. And this was very meaningful for me and my classmates because we had the fortune of going to a school, Dalhousie Medical School, where that idea of the importance of the humanities was really being discovered and being worked upon and implemented in a real way. And that was the work of Dr. Jock Murray, who's a well-known name in the Halifax area in Nova Scotia, who started the humanities program there. And from our very first week of medical school, even though this was quite a few years ago, the humanities were embedded in some of the training that we did, including that Robert Pope's family came to speak to us as medical students at that time and introduced his work to us. Robert had passed away by this period, but his work really lived on. And this was an image that had a lot of meaning for me because I went on to discover that the area of medicine that I wanted to practice was end-of-life care. So I think this had meaning, his images had meaning for everyone in our medical school class, but I kept seeing these images coming up, especially in the oncology world, in the palliative care world, and even to some extent in the medical assistance in dying world. And so I see his images and I feel that they portray meaning in a way that words cannot, and I think there's incredible power in that. I did want to take a moment because we do have his words in this book. He has written in this book, and I wanted to tell you what his comments were on this painting, which is called Visitors. This painting is like a psychological ecosystem where the worlds of healthy and sick meet. The patient is seen in the context of his community. The focus is on the response of the patient's community, which is both positive and negative. The emotions are varied, ranging from concern to indifference, from pessimism to support. Many of the people are brightly painted like flowers. The image is framed by two opposing forces. On the right, the man aggressively gesturing downward can be interpreted as having a negative meaning. The gift of a book from the woman on the left can be seen as a positive gesture and ultimately a symbol of hope. The mood may be somber, but I feel this is an optimistic work, expressing faith in the continuity of our human community.
Lovely, Megan. And you know, one of the things you just made me think of that many people in the audience may know is there's really interesting literature to show us that when we teach medical trainees to look at a painting and notice the kinds of things that you just read the artist sharing with us about his own painting, something really interesting happens. They become more observant when they walk into the room to see you. They begin to notice things that they have been trained to look for in paintings, and now they see things a little more clearly. So there's that fascinating body of evidence that supports both the human development piece of that, but also growth as a technical, development of a technical skill as well. Now, Paula, I'm going to move on to you. You are a radiologist, so you spend your entire day looking at images. But I know that you are also a person who's deeply interested in stories, both as an art form, both for personal and cultural reasons, and both as a tool for, and also as a tool for affecting change. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your relationship to storytelling, particularly your viewpoint as an Indigenous person.
Storytelling is really the cornerstone of a lot of Indigenous cultures, a lot of communities. For me, it's how I see myself, how I see my family, how I see the world around me. It's how we pass down traditions and knowledge. And it's been a very important part of for me personally, growing up. So even as a child, you'd hear the stories. So I'm from a small community called Corner Brook in Newfoundland, on the west coast of Newfoundland. And the Mi'kmaq people there have been, were essentially erased in 1949 when we joined Confederation. And there's been a slow resurgence of our culture. But think about stories and how you view yourself. So as a child growing up, the stories I heard in my community and in my education about my people, about the Mi'kmaq people, was that essentially we're portrayed as savages, that we were responsible for the killing of the Beothuk people. So it's all these very terrible images. And I was more fortunate than most people in my community because I would go home and I had grandparents and parents who would tell me different stories, right? Stories about my great-grandfather, Matty Mitchell, and very positive things about our culture. So I was fortunate in that way, that the stories I learned, the stories that I internalized were positive. And that really affects how you see yourself. And of course, as physicians, we all carry ourselves into our work. And that storytelling has really stuck with me, and it's helped me in my clinical work. It's helped me in my advocacy work. And I also do some dispute resolution, so it helps me in that work as well. So, in terms of relating to patients, I know I'm a radiologist and people picture me sitting in front of a computer all day, but I mostly, when I was in clinical medicine, did interventional radiology. So I actually saw patients for my whole day. And one of the things I would always think about is, what is this person's story? So sometimes we'll see patients who might not be compliant with the medical care, and it's easy to sort of get frustrated and, not put so much effort into that relationship. But you really have to step back as a healthcare provider and start asking the question, why is this person not doing what's in their best interest? And really, I guess, take that time to hear their stories, to hear where they're coming from, what their values are, what their beliefs are. Perhaps I'm recommending something that doesn't align with their belief system, and there's different ways that we could treat their illness or their symptoms. So it's really been important, I think, and I think I've brought that into my clinical relationships, certainly into my advocacy work. So I do a lot of Indigenous health and equity advocacy with the Canadian Medical Association. And as you said, I also teach Indigenous health at Memorial University. And I found that bringing stories into those spaces really helps people see who I am, who Indigenous peoples are, their experiences, but also the other way. So if you want people to engage with this history and and how we're moving forward, you also have to hear their stories, right? Where are they coming from? Hear their concerns. So I think it's that two-way street that really helps, and certainly with our relationships with our colleagues. Like, medicine is very high stakes, it's very stressful. There's lots of tense moments where we might not communicate as effectively as we could with our colleagues. But if you just take that step back and think about, what is that person's story? Where are they coming from? We've already talked about it. It humanizes people, and it makes those relationships easier. It certainly helps you manage any conflict that exists in our workplace. So I think on every level, right from personal and into all of my different professional capacities, I've really brought that storytelling into those spaces, and I think it's made me certainly a better doctor, and more patient, and even, I guess, a better parent at home, right? In the same sense, on a personal level. So it's been a big part of my journey, for sure.
Paula, just as you share this, I find myself thinking about comparing your practice to Megan's, and a thread that sort of jumped out at me as you were speaking is a physician actually also at the University of Manitoba by the name of Harvey Chachinov, who's done a lot of work with a program called Dignity Therapy. And a big part of Dignity Therapy is really focusing at the end of life on a patient's story, a time when so often people begin to think of it as peripheral, as not important. The situation is coming to an end, so why would you focus on stories? Of course, Dr. Chachinov and colleagues have shown that this is actually an urgent and compelling piece to giving a person a good end of life. And just to build on that, Megan, if we don't think so much about life stories, but maybe at the end of life, ways that you have seen patients and families bring art into those final days and final hours, what can you share with us about some of the most memorable experiences that you've had in that way?
Thank you for the question. I think every experience is memorable. I've learned, quite honestly, something from every patient, and I think most physicians would say the same thing. I feel like nothing brings laser focus to one's life as much as when you know that time is limited. And that gives us the gift of appreciating our priorities, our values, what's most important to us. So I think I've been in a very privileged position at being at the bedside of many people who are nearing end of life and having that reminder given to me through them. So I've witnessed really beautiful things, and I would say in a palliative care setting or an end-of-life care setting in hospital, you can see who someone is based on the things that they've accumulated around them, certainly by the people who are around them, but also by, if it's a home visit, looking at the books on someone's shelves or seeing the artwork that's in their room. If you're in someone's hospital room, what things have been important for them to gather in their room to have around them. It's really an expression of who they are. And there's a saying in palliative care rare that we die how we lived, and I think that's so true. So the things that bring us purpose and meaning in life become heightened and more important as we near end of life. From the specific standpoint of medical assistance in dying, the unique opportunity that patients have if they are choosing medical assistance in dying is they have an actual opportunity to plan their end of life. And that is a unique experience that most people don't have. And we see very creative, amazing, interesting, beautiful things that can happen around that. And we actually call that like the choreography of what MAID is going to be like. So people being able to choose the where, the when, the how, the who is there. And then this really cool thing that happens for a lot of people where they want artistic expression in those moments. So I could be here for the next several hours probably telling you various stories of touching moments that I've been witness to. And again, it's such a privilege to have been in those places. But a couple of stories that might stand out, for example, we had a woman who had ALS, and she wanted to have MAID in her home, but actually not in her home specifically. She wanted to have MAID around a bonfire in her backyard. And so she had her chosen family invited, and she had mimosas served. And she had a very specific playlist of important music for her because she was, I would call her a musician. She would say an amateur musician, but music was a huge part of her life. And so she had a very carefully curated playlist of her favorite music playing when she was dying. And the impact of that moment was incredible for those people who were around her, for myself certainly. And I will tell you, when I hear those specific tunes, like a specific Leonard Cohen song that I heard earlier when we were outside and you were in here, for example, it evokes in me the memory of that experience with her. So music was really paramount to her end-of-life experience. I can think of another gentleman who was a gardener and a painter who had been in hospital for many, many months and really wanted to have MAID at home. He wanted to finally go home and to have his end of life happen there. And so he got to have end of life in the room that he wanted to be in, with his paintings on the walls around him and flowers in vases scattered throughout the room and a dog on his lap. And so for him, that was very, very meaningful. So his expression really came out in that moment as well. So just numerous stories of really incredible moments, and art, who we are, how we express ourselves becomes very important in those times.
Oh, I love those stories. Just so vivid, right? Just sort of feel them as you hear those moments. Megan, that makes me think about something Abby said a little bit earlier, talking about sort of the false dichotomy between arts and sciences. We behave as though these things are on, two different poles and have no relationship to each other. But of course, we all are up here today with the viewpoint that that is not correct. And I think that's probably a belief shared by most of you, considering the space that we're in. But Abby, I wonder, as you think about that for a moment, the importance of what we often call the health humanities now in medical education and training for health professionals. If you could now go back and insert any of these elements into medical training and the development of young doctors-to-be and nurses-to-be and other healthcare workers, how would you do that? What would you put in there? What would that look like for you?
It's a good question. I don't know if I have the definite answer to that, but I think I think exposure to art is important, or exposure to humanities is really important. And I think whether this is visual art, whether it's literature, whether it's, I can say, philosophy, whether it's music, I think those are tools to actually learn a different perspective of human beings. And an intensive occupation with one of these areas, I think opens your mind. And in the end, you need to be creative in life. You need to be creative as a physician. You need to be creative as a CEO of a company. You need to be creative as an entrepreneur. So creativity is actually not limited to art, right? And so I really think exposure to one or two of these tools, and you don't have to become a painter or a musician, but just exposure to it and hearing other people talking about it and making your own independent thoughts about it. That's also somehow a school of critical thinking. I'm not sure whether that captures what I wanted to say.
Well, what you made me think of with your answer is something that I know you and I have talked about over the years, which is, there's this element of uncertainty in medical practice. And we don't want it to be that way, and we don't want it when we've all been patients, every one of us up here, or dealt with serious illness in our family members. And of course, when we go see someone who's looking after us, we don't want there to be uncertainty. And yet the reality of being a healthcare practitioner of any type is there is tremendous uncertainty. But layer on top of that are the way that we teach often infers to our students that they should be able to eliminate all uncertainty and come up with the correct answer. And we've all probably had experience either with ourselves or loved ones inhabiting a zone of uncertainty, not knowing what a symptom is from, nobody knowing what a symptom is from. And art is one of the things that helps us build a tolerance for uncertainty, appropriate uncertainty, not being lazy and not ruling things out, but just that as an intrinsic quality, do you think?
Yeah, that's totally. And I would even go further, right? Art is often ambiguous, and our life is often ambiguous. Good and bad is often close by. And so realizing that there's not like in science, in the medical sciences, there's a right and wrong. In humanities or in art, there's no right and wrong. There's something that speaks to you or something that doesn't speak to you, but doesn't mean that's right or wrong. And so I think it's important to get exposed to that.
Remember, I was sharing a story with you about a musician performing their own composition who said at the concert, I think this is what this song is about. And just the revelation that maybe the artist doesn't even know, that's part of it.
If I may expand on that,
yeah.
I mean, this is very personal. I mean, when I paint, I'm an abstract painter or a semi-abstract painter, so I don't want to, I paint out of intuition. So I have a white canvas in front of me and I make a first mark out of intuition and then things develop from there. And so it's actually right brain, empathy, emotion that drives this. And in the science of medicine, it's always left brain, logic thinking. And so I think we need both parts to be complete humans and to be able to treat our patients and, what I said in the beginning, ourselves as a provider to stay balanced and be able to treat these patients.
I want to pivot now because one of the things that we have been tasked, this very small subject of discussing today, includes health equity and equitable access to healthcare systems. And again, as I shared in our introductions, Dr. Cashin has been an absolute leader in this area in Canada. So Paula, I wonder, as you sit back and look at some of the many things that you have accomplished, I wonder if you think of the effort that you are perhaps the most proud of. What was the strategy that you used to make a difference in that case? Or what were some of the strategies? And maybe helping give us a bit of a window inside that experience for you.
So I think some of my most important work has been done through the Canadian Medical Association. So I'm vice chair of the board. I'm the first Indigenous board member at the CMA. I was very fortunate to be there at a time when there were other two Indigenous physicians on the board as well. So many people will know Dr. Alika LaFontaine, who was our first Indigenous president, and also another wonderful storyteller, as most people are aware. And Dr. Santana Hernandez was our medical student representative as well. So at that time, it was about 2 or 3 years ago, we started the Indigenous Health Work. we brought together a group of Indigenous elders, knowledge keepers from across Canada, who were First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And we really started the work on sort of what does Indigenous health look like and how can we affect that change. And that progressed then into last fall. So in September 2024, the CMA did an apology to Indigenous peoples for the harm that they'd experienced in healthcare. I'm sure some people have heard about that. It got national, international attention. It was beyond anything that I ever dreamed we could do in Canada, and I'm quite proud to be part of that work. The reason why I think it was so impactful, one, it really showed that even in a colonial corporate organization like the Canadian Medical Association, that things could be done differently. We could bring in Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, and really blend that with our traditional or the Western ways of doing things. And that was done incredibly well because there was buy-in from our board of directors, there was buy-in from our CEO, and they were very supportive of that approach. So as one example, typically as a board director, I'm not involved in the day-to-day operations of the organization, you're hands off. But in this particular project, the 3 Indigenous physicians on the board we were very involved in that sort of day-to-day part of the apology. So we brought that Indigenous knowledge, that Indigenous lens to the work that didn't exist in the organization. And I think having that work Indigenous-led was hugely impactful. First of all, because the stories were told, that perspective was there. A lot of the heavy lifting then was done by the Canadian Medical Association, but it was done in a good way under the guidance of Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers. And I think it was an eye-opener for the Medical Association in terms of how we do the work. So an example that I often use when I'm talking about that work is, the corporate agenda. So anytime we have a meeting, there's an agenda. I'm vice chair of the board, so lots of times I'm, the person chairing the meeting. And you're very comfortable with this business-type meeting, right? And your agenda's there and you follow it exactly. And I can remember when the first time I had to go as the representative for the board to the Indigenous Guiding Circle to have a meeting, the staff did up this very corporate agenda for me. And I kind of took it and looked at it and I was like, this is interesting. And I said, and I understand this is sort of the goals you have in mind, but this is not how the Indigenous elders are going to work, right? This is going to be done in a good way. I can tell you half of this agenda is going to be taken up with just us getting to know each other as, peoples in different communities and who we are and our stories. So it's back to that storytelling piece again. And so I really had to sit down and have a conversation with the CEO and the board chair and say, it's fine for the staff to give this, but don't expect that I'm coming back to the next meeting with every single point on this covered. And in fact, it's a good thing because most of the times I came back with stuff that was more impactful, more meaningful. And so I think that was an eye-opener for them, and they continued, this is over 2 years, so I continued to get these agendas, and I'd kind of have a little chuckle every time I got one. But what was amazing is the day after the apology, we had a debrief with all the members of the Indigenous Guiding Circle and the full board. And I can remember showing up that morning, and you can imagine we were exhausted after that huge day before. It was emotional, it was just so much work. Leading up to that point. And I remember showing up at the meeting, and normally at my desk there'd be the agenda, and I was thinking, there's no agenda here. What's going on? And so I kind of was texting, and I was like, no one's giving me an agenda. Like, what are we doing? They're like, we're going to do this the Indigenous way. And they let me just wing the whole thing, which I thought was, honestly, it was more meaningful to me than any of the work we'd ever done, because they finally were understanding that this work could be done in a different way. So I think that willingness to see things differently is true reconciliation, right? This is how things are going to change. And I think, the fact that we had so many Indigenous physicians and our elders and knowledge keepers, so it was truly Indigenous-led, that was obviously a huge part of the success. But I think of anything that I've done, that day in particular was September 18th of last fall, and I think it's been the most impactful and memorable for me in all of this work that I've done.
Wow. And it's funny, just as you were talking, I find myself thinking about, again, what you said, other ways of seeing, other ways of knowing, other frameworks, and art being one bridge, a more familiar bridge perhaps to many people, of getting to a point, getting to a place where we can begin to see things outside of the perspective that, both scripts us, but also confines us. Moving from that example of how we can affect change around health equity, I found myself thinking, Megan, about something that we also were speaking about a couple of days ago, and that is this dialogue that often occurs. We read articles in major newspapers and we hear interviews suggesting that MAID is often disproportionately used by marginalized individuals. And I wonder if you could talk about that and share some of your knowledge and experience in that regards.
Thank you for the important question. MAID has been a legal option in Canada since 2016, as people will know. And I remember, and probably all of you do as well, lots of fear, uncertainty, lack of information around the time that it was introduced. And there was a real concern that marginalized people may be at risk of having MAID or having MAID forced on them when they would otherwise choose a different option. And I even remember listening to a CBC call-in show one Sunday afternoon, hearing about a patient who called in and was so fearful of this that they thought they should actually have tattooed on their person that MAID would not be a choice that they would want. So this has been something that we hear, and for the most part, MAID is a much better known option. It's much better understood. People have a better sense of it and know that this isn't true. But I think this is an interesting place where the science really needs to provide good data to show people that that's actually the case. And we fortunately do have very, very robust data to show us that marginalized people are not choosing MAID because they are marginalized. And that is by almost every measure or every objectable measure of marginalization that one can think of. So for example, financial marginalization, educational marginalization, lack of access to services, an example being palliative care. So by any objective measure, we know that marginalized MAID patients are not choosing MAID because they're marginalized. So the data, the rigor, the science there really does become extremely important for us to be able to assure people of that. And in fact, what we do know from this very robust data, and this is Health Canada reporting as well as the Ontario Coroner's report that is released annually, is that marginalized patients, in fact, tend to be more privileged and often much more privileged than patients who die of natural cause or who are living with chronic illness. So again, we're talking a lot about the humanities, and I believe so strongly in the importance of that, and the data and the science and the rigor has become very, very important for us with regards to medical assistance in dying.
As I listen to all of you talk about your experiences and the kind of work that you've done, and Abby, we didn't talk as much about your clinical background as a transplant physician, but you can imagine, and I'm a general internal medicine physician now working in addictions. I mean, we see some heavy things, and we accompany people and chaperone them through some very hard times in their lives. Megan, I'm just going to stay with you for another minute. You've done some work here supporting physicians who are dealing with the weight of some of those experiences, and perhaps also part of the crisis that we are experiencing right now in healthcare and in many other professions, of course. But in healthcare, it is an existential threat to us, the crisis of physician and healthcare worker burnout. And going back to where we started today, stories, working with narrative, artistic approaches to beginning to deal with what we have been through in our lives. What are some of your observations working with physicians in a peer support way using those stories?
So we have a peer support program in PEI where we have trained about 18 trained physicians who know how to do peer support for colleagues who may be experiencing a work-related stress. And when we first started this program, we expected those work-related stresses to mostly be about there was a really distressing patient outcome and everyone on the team is really, feeling that. And what we actually saw over time is sometimes we would have reach outs into our program for that. However, sometimes what we started to see more often is that people were reaching into our program for peer support because they were experiencing burnout. And I think it goes back to what Ebby said and what we've been talking about. I heard medical education or being in medicine described as a very narrow path that can be hard to deviate from and can be all-consuming. And I think one of the themes that we would hear from some of our physicians reaching in for peer support who are experiencing burnout is when you're working so hard and you're so burdened by a system that isn't functioning that well, what we can lose first is some of the things that fill our bucket, some of the things that give us self-expression, because we're so busy focused on that, that we start to lose who we are as people. And that can relate to a lot of distress for people who are experiencing really challenging situations at work. So we would hear that from people, and the ability to have a life outside of a career that is certainly very rewarding. It's a privilege to be in it, but can be all-consuming. We certainly hear that thread of story from some of the physicians who are reaching into our program.
And Paula, I wonder, as you listen to Megan reflect on that question, what some of your perspectives might be and how they could be informed by your own background as an Indigenous physician.
I mean, that really speaks to me, Megan. I'm going to be honest, I've seen many of my colleagues experiencing that same thing, that burnout, and it comes back again to what Ebby was talking about the whole self. So how I think about it and how I conceptualize it is based on the medicine wheel. This is really sort of, I think, a really good summary of what we've been talking about here in terms of wellness, in terms of advocacy, and how we make the system better. So when I teach Indigenous health, this is sort of the model I use, and the way I sequence my lectures and our talks and our sessions. So it always starts in the E. So that's the yellow part, the emotional part of it. And I think it's really important to think about your emotions, right? So when you first start hearing about inequities in the system, or as physicians, is that anger and that disbelief about the state of the system, where we are. Sometimes it's even denial about how bad it is, how hard you're working. Really, sort of taking accountability for system changes and how it's impacting your emotional health. And then I think about knowledge. And this is where physicians and healthcare workers in general really like to focus their attention. It's that knowledge part, right? It's the book learning. It's what we're very, very comfortable in that space. So it's the formal lectures, the research, the data you talk about. And it's important. It does have its role, right? It informs our work. But it also, in terms of knowledge, I always think about knowledge of, how you see yourself. So, if a lot of us have imposter syndrome. We're in spaces where we might, well, for myself, an Indigenous woman would never have been in the space that I'm in. So a certain amount of that, certainly earlier in my career, was overcoming that. And I think, some of that is focused on that part of the self. And probably one of the more important areas is the spiritual part of it. So on the black segment there. And that comes down to your values and who you are. And I think this is where the burnout comes into it, when your values don't align with what we're seeing in the system. So when I can't provide timely care for my patient, when I don't have time to sit and really, really speak with a patient who might desperately need me because I've got 10 other patients coming behind and I'm being pushed by staff, we got to get this case done, and the next one is coming through the door. And I think that's where the burnout happens, is when you lose that humanity part of it. And it's really that spiritual part of how do we get that back? And it's hard in the public system, the way things are structured right now. And then you think about actions and behaviors. So this is really how do you fix the system? How do you become an ally? How do you create belonging for everyone in the system? And how do we fix it? What actions do we need to take to actually fix our healthcare system and make it workable for physicians, for all healthcare workers, and most importantly for our patients? Because right now, I think the system is not working for any of us. On a personal note, I can share that I was for a long time working in the public system and the private system, and I've recently stepped away from the public healthcare job for those reasons, right? Because it's a hard space to be in right now. And my private job, in a lot of ways, it's easier. I still get that satisfaction. I do my work. I still feel like I'm helping patients, but I'm doing it in a way that aligns with my values and allows me personally to achieve this balance. And this is a balance that I never had when I was working full-time in the public system. And I think that speaks volumes when our healthcare workers, it's not just physicians, it's all of us, no matter what your job is in the healthcare system right now, people are struggling. And if we're not safe and if we're not having this wellness, then how do we bring that to our patients? How do we make our patients well? I think we're at a scary point and hopefully a turning point in our system where these things are going to start getting addressed. But for right now, it's quite challenging, and it speaks to what you're seeing in your peer peer support program as well. And I suspect right across the country we'll be seeing that.
Yeah. And, Paula, what you make me think of with those points, you emphasize that spiritual component. And that's really interesting, right? Because, of course, our medical training comes from a secular place for the most part. But what that can divorce people from is that whether people find their meaning through the spiritual element of practice, like whatever it is for an individual, one of the things the literature unequivocally tells us is that when people lose the sense of meaning and purpose in their work, however they define it, or we often call it mission alignment in the literature, they become transactional. So people start making the choices that don't benefit us as patients, right? When your doctor or nurse practitioner or whoever scales back their time 50% because it's the only thing that they feel they can do to save themselves, not only is that really not a good thing for them because it's going to erode their sense of meaning and purpose, it's a terrible thing for you as a patient. It's a terrible thing for all of us trying to see our own physicians as well. So it just really illustrates those ways in which all of these problems are interconnected and actually do need a more holistic approach than we often think about. Abby, you looked like you had something to say about that.
I don't know whether I should say it. I take my artist hat off and take my health system hat that's in retirement. I take it back on. I mean, the elephant in the room is how can we change the system to make what we all want happen? I don't know whether I should say that, but I say it anyways. I think one of the big things is that medicine or healthcare is too much politicized. Healthcare is not rocket science. A health system is not rocket science. So let the people who know it run it and not the politicians. Politicians have a 4-year cycle in mind. Healthcare decisions need to have a 20 to 50-year cycle in mind. If you build a new hospital, you spend money for 4 years, 10 years, and you will not be elected. If you make unpopular decisions, you won't get elected in the next cycle. So nobody does them. And I think that's the root cause for the problems we have.
Well, since you said something provocative, I'll say something else provocative, too. Not that you had to go first. I can do fine on my own. But, what you make me think about, Abby, is what people often say, that healthcare is not political or physicians should not be political. But if ever there's been a time in the history of humanity when it was clear that that cannot be true, that time is now. So often, I often point out that this idea that we have of, it was, first suggested over 100 years ago by William Osler, equanimity in medicine, the idea that we should, or equanimity, I always leave out a syllable, that we should be not perturbable, sort of steady despite the waves on the sea. And in many ways that is a desirable quality, but it can also transition to being unmoved, unaffected, not advocating, not responding when social injustice urges us to respond, because we are people who, our voices, that is one of the privileges of being a physician. Our voices carry weight. People do listen to us, and a lot of that is based on relationships, and the relationships that we are fortunate enough to form with people during times when we build trust. So I think you really touch on something there, that we often try to keep these dialogues apolitical or non-partisan, but in an age of polarization, as you explored yesterday, that is probably no longer a realistic expectation. And I think it also speaks to, bringing it back to the arts, a deep need for self-awareness. If you are going to wade into public spaces, saying difficult things, high-stakes things, the more you are able to examine your own motivations, your own history, what subconscious forces shape your perspectives and opinions in ways that are very good, and sometimes ways that maybe can be a little narcissistic for any one of us. That is a critical part, I think, of the kinds of skills that and self-awareness and personal development that art invites. It brings me, Abby, actually, I was going to give the last question to you. You are now retired. You've left clinical practice. You're painting. You're in a totally different stage of your life. And I find myself wondering if instead of on this stage at the Confederation Center, if we were with a group of young physicians and you were speaking to a graduating class, giving them advice about the future, their careers, and thinking about it from your very holistic perspective, you not just as a scientist, but as an artist and a thinker and a scholar. What advice would you give them to carry them through the hard times ahead?
Well, I would say you only live once. So whenever you have an opportunity, weigh the risks and benefits carefully, but then jump on it if you feel the balance is good for you. Don't try to lose yourself in guarantees and securities that you will never have. And I see that unfortunately very often in our young colleagues and students. They want to know that they have a position when they graduate in that town. I think if you try to get that, that's not going to happen. Just try to be open, not uncritical, but open, weigh risks and benefits, and then do what you feel is the best for you at that moment. And that needs often, some would say heart, others say guts. It's an emotional thing, in the end, a decision to jump. But you have to jump, otherwise somebody jumps for you.
I love it. There will be no jumping in this portion of the session. Everybody stay calm. So thank you to all of you for weaving such beautiful and interesting responses to the questions that we found ourselves exploring here.